19th principle, which really has to do with a subject that was the most discussed in all of colonial America in building a new government, and that is, well, you tell me, what was it? What was the most discussed topic? How are we going to limit the authority of the general government or the federal government? We don't want another King George experience. They had just come through the Articles of Confederation where they had no executive, no power to tax. They realized it needed to have more energy. We've discussed this before. All right, we're going to give more energy to the federal government, but how in the world are we going to limit it so that it doesn't run away? That's the discussion for principle number 19. What's Jefferson's little phrase? How are we going to do it? We are going to bind down the office holders by the what? By the what? By the chains of the Constitution. We're going to put chains around this thing so tightly it can't move. And when the Constitution was being voted upon, after they finally got it drafted and being voted upon very last, a delegate from Virginia actually said, I still oppose this. And that was kind of a surprise. That was George Mason. Even though Virginia voted to accept it, George Mason was accepted. And he said, the thing that bothers me about this document is that it has no Bill of Rights. Well, they made the point that, the whole document is a Bill of Rights. Why do you need... We haven't given the government enough authority to trample on your rights. Why do you need a Bill of Rights? What would you say to that? You know what he said? Classic statement. They will anyway. They always do. They've always done it. He says, I'd rather chop off my right hand than put it to that document without a Bill of Rights. See, he knew the tendency of government. He says, you've got to put that in there. So, we have the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which were added right after it was ratified, a couple of years after it was ratified. And I want you to go now, this is on page 224, and we're going to read the 10th Amendment. 10th Amendment says, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. What does that mean? The powers that we haven't what? Specifically delegated, enumerated, itemized, listed, however you want to say it. The powers not delegated to the United States in the Constitution are left where? With where? With the states and the people. That's correct. And we're going to be studying through the remainder of this course, especially when we get to the Constitution, what those specific powers are. But in summary, I want to tell you that the legislature, the lawmaking branch of Congress, of the government, we call Congress, was given very specific powers. Does anybody know about how many powers Congress has? This is exciting about the Constitution because it's not vague. It is very clear. And if you turn to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, there they all are listed. These are the powers that Congress can do. And if you were to count them, depending on how you count them, but there's about 20. 20 powers of Congress. Can you believe this? Not 20,000 as you see them doing today, but just 20. Let me ask you, if you were a congressman, you were in Congress, and a bill came up, just whatever the bill would be, what's the first thing you ought to do? First thing, go to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, if you don't already know it, and see if you have the power to even deal with that kind of an issue. I'll just throw one out here. Let's say a bill comes to you dealing with Social Security, to create a Social Security program, as it did back in the 40s. First thing you should have done, gone to the Constitution and say, let's see now, do I have the authority to vote on, to set up a system of Social Security? Does Congress have that authority? You read down the list and guess what? It's not there. So you have to say what? I don't have any authority to do this. As good as it may sound to some people, no authority. So your vote has to be what? No. No authority. Isn't that interesting? That's pretty simple, isn't it? See, that's what the founders said. We have listed very specifically what you can do. So, 20 powers to Congress. How many powers, how many areas of responsibility do you think the President has? This will surprise you in Article 2. 6. Oh my. Not 6,000. 6. We'll go over those later in the course. 6. Now when it comes to the federal judiciary in Article 3, how many kinds of cases did the founders assign to the federal courts? Did you know that they said the federal courts can hear very specific kinds of cases, and here they are, all listed in Article 3. Anybody want to take a guess on how many? 13. That's pretty close. Actually, it's 11. 11 kinds of cases. So, let's say you're on the federal bench, whether it's a Supreme Court or a lower court. And let's say a case comes to you on the subject of abortion. The first thing you ought to do is what? Go to Article 3 of the Constitution, because that's the document by which you're governed, right? Federal courts. And see if you have authority to adjudicate in that matter. Guess what? You won't find it there. So what do you have to say? No jurisdiction. Have no authorization to hear this kind of a case. Same way with prayer in schools, Bible reading in schools, and a host of another thousands of other kinds of cases. No jurisdiction. Of course, if you don't know the Constitution, then you think you can just hear anything anybody wants to bring along. Would you remember those figures there? You'll be asked to give those again. These powers are few delegated powers in the Constitution. 20, 6, and 11. Will you remember those? All right. Now I want to show you a chart. Now, you've seen this before in the book, I think. This chart represents what the Constitution did. First of all, it put the government where on our spectrum? In the middle. In the middle. And do you remember what Jefferson said he wanted to do to make sure it wouldn't move? What he wanted to do? Bind them down with the chains of the Constitution. So this government will not move. Okay? It has very limited power. I want you to notice something else about this chart. The lines running from the federal government down, where do they stop? They stop at the state level. Is that instructive? Do those lines go down to you from the federal government? No, they don't. They stop at the states. What level of government deals with you? States. See that chart there, how it is? Very clear to the founders. They did not want the federal government dealing right with the people all the time. What would be pushed out if it did? The states. What would happen to states' rights? They'd be gone. Do you see that concept? It's the states, really, that have the most government, when you think about it, when it concerns the lives and the property and the prosperity of the people. Okay? So, let's read on page 225. Read a little Hamilton here, who talks about this. 225 near the bottom of the page. You with me? He says, this balance between the national and state governments ought to be dwelt on with peculiar attention, as it is of utmost importance. It forms a double security to the people. If one encroaches on their rights, they will find a powerful protection in the other. Indeed, they will both be prevented from overpassing their constitutional limits by certain rivalships which will ever subsist between them. What's he talking about here? If the federal government takes on too much power and wants to get to the people, who will stop them? The states. You see that? If the states begin to encroach on the federal responsibility, who will stop them? The federal government, because they're supreme law of the land. Do you understand this? This is real power in the federal government and real power in the state government, where power rivals power. We talked about this in our discussion on the checks and balances. If you want to check the usurpation of power, what do you have to have for that check to be effective? You have to have power. You can't just, be, oh, please don't do that. You've got to have real power. This is power rivaling power. And so, the state's power was balanced with the federal government. Okay? And as Hamilton said, if one seeks more power, the other will put it back into line and say, Originally, the senators were sent to Congress by whom? We've talked about this a little bit. Who chose the senators to go to Congress? The state legislatures. Because the Senate really was whose house? It was the state's house. It wasn't the people's house. It represented the states. And if the federal government got too powerful, where would they be stopped in their power grab? In the Senate, who protected states' rights. Do you all see that? Okay. If Congress legislates against the states, the Senate, which was originally the state's house, will oppose it and say, hey, wait a minute, we're not going to do that. That will violate and destroy the rights of the states, thereby keeping the balance of power. See that? What changed all that? See, this is one of the chains that Jefferson was talking about. But this chain has been broken. Does anybody know what broke that chain? 17th Amendment, which did what? Few Americans really understand the damage that was done by the 17th Amendment. It gave the election of senators to the people and said, now we're going to have the people elect the senators. Well, what does that make the Senate then? Is that still the state's house? No, because the senators have to appeal to whom? Not the states to get elected. Who do they have to appeal to? The people, the same people that the congressmen have to appeal to. So what we really have is two what? Two houses of representatives. Do you see the damage down there? Who's watching out for states' rights in the federal government? Nobody. So the states have to get together in their little governors' conferences and pass a resolution and go plead with the federal government for mercy. See, that was not intended that way. There was supposed to be a balance of power. And that's all been destroyed by the 17th Amendment. And so now the federal government can do what? Because the states are out of the way, the federal government can go where? Right directly to the people. Have they done it? Oh, yes. And now I'm going to show you a little chart here, which is the last screen. that depicts this incredibly dangerous position. You remember the last chart where everything was balanced. Look at this one. Tell me what's happened to the federal government up on our spectrum. The chains were broken, so it moved. In which direction would it most likely move? Oh yeah, towards tyranny, more power. Has it taken on more power? Absolutely. What else do you notice about that chart? Where do the lines go from the federal government? Right down into your pocketbook, into your bank account, into your family, into your home, into your school. Well, not this one, but most schools. Into almost everything you're involved in. The federal government is involved. Where are the states? Nowhere. Yeah, almost nowhere. Well, they're there, but they're just kind of, you know, figureheads, right? You know, they still do some things. But there is no balance of power anymore between the states and the federal government. This whole concept of the 19th principle, you limit the power of the federal government, has basically been obliterated. This is real damage. And so I ask you, my young friends, who's gearing up to change all this and put it back where it's supposed to be? Whose job is that? There you go. That's your job. I told you long ago, my generation blew it, and I apologized. But now it's your job. Are you ready for it? Is it a tiring job? Yeah, it's not going to be easy. But somebody has got to help put this thing back together again. And the first thing to do is to learn how it should be, which we've talked about today, and that's the purpose of this class. Thank you, everybody, for being with us today.